Well, thank you, Brian, for that extraordinarily moving and sobering presentation as well. I'll certainly be giving my daughters a hug as soon as I get home, and I wish we had a cheque for $123 million to give you right now. Our next speaker is Heidi Wilmot, and Heidi is a non-resident fellow at the Stimson Centre at the moment. She has extensive experience with the United Nations, having served in the UN Operations and Crisis Centre in New York, and she's also been posted in Southern Sudan and Somalia. And I also should mention that she is the editor of what must be the field-leading text on protection of civilians. Well, that makes it even more important. And it contains terrific contributions from both academics and practitioners that are leaders in the field. And Heidi, it's a terrific pleasure to introduce you.
Good afternoon, everyone. We're nearly there. Firstly, my warmest thanks to Mike and the UNAA for inviting me here. I am a daughter of Canberra, and it's lovely to come back to her fresh air and lovely breezes. So thank you. Right, I am going to tell you a story, a diplomatic story, but it's a story with a moral, so hopefully something that we can draw some lessons from. Australia is closely associated with the protection of civilians in the UN, particularly in New York, because it is an issue that we have shown diplomatic leadership on. And that's the story I'm going to tell you, the inside story of those initial years when we were moving forward with that issue. But before I do that, I'm going to provide a little bit of context. First, a quick word on people and ideas within the UN, how that works, and then what I would call the peacekeeping equation. So first, in international relations, there's a mythology that can develop around an event. From the outside, it can appear that there is a strong internal logic, that an idea appears fully formed and understood, and that states line up for or against it in accordance with their national interests. From the inside, that's very much not how it happens. It's messy, it's multi-directional, and often dependent on chance and the whims or thoughtfulness of particular people. One of the things I learnt when I first turned up in New York was how personality dependent international relations is. A bold, thoughtful, determined individual can make a huge difference, and a clever one can stop that happening. The UN's a very conservative organisation. It's one of the reasons for its longevity. But in order to move forward and remain relevant, it needs heroes. It needs thought leaders. Some of those we have in this room. It needs people willing to upset the established order and to take risks and back themselves. Often this means putting the organisation's interests before their own interests, the interests of their mission, or their national interests, and often that's done at significant personal costs. Occasionally it works. Another thing that I learned is that language and ideas have a particular power and a special evolutionary trajectory within the UN. They may start as a kernel over a discussion or a glass of wine, perhaps after a conference. They may start as something that happens in the field out of necessity. And they grow from there. But once they enter into UN circles, they take on a life of their own and can't be controlled. Language is incredibly important. It's actually a bit Orwellian in the UN. It often doesn't carry its natural meaning. It carries the meaning that it's imbued with. And therefore, whether an idea succeeds or fails can be, firstly, partly attributed to how it's communicated, what language is used. This is particularly important in the case of protection of civilians, which, as we go along, I may refer to as POC. And then the path that an idea takes is important. It's critical that it's not seen as part of a broader, perhaps nefarious agenda of a particular member state. So it needs to have a particular pathway to be accepted. And then once it hits UN circles, the groupthink begins. Orwell again. Often we have clever people with influential voices who get in early, do their analysis, stake their position. Sometimes these are thoughtful, objective, good people and we get great outcomes. Sometimes that's very much not the case. And the problem is that these initial reactions often form the thought processes of those who are less familiar with the issues, and so that becomes accepted wisdom. Soon everyone is talking about the issues using the same terms, the same language, and highlighting the same challenges and benefits. Those who hadn't heard of it become overnight experts. But this rise in awareness, this is very good, it's a good thing. And then the ideas are dealt with or not, and often they come back again. The cycle moves on. So seeing an idea come to fruition within the UN is about much, much more than merits. It's about adroit political strategy, careful diplomatic shepherding, and sustained energy by a couple of people who care. The story of Australia's diplomatic engagement on the protection of civilians is a story about people and ideas. Right, so now a couple of words on what I'm going to call the peacekeeping equation. As we've heard time and again over the last 2 days, Australia's contribution to peacekeeping is about more than just boots on the ground. What happens in New York, in the Council, the GA and the Secretariat is also incredibly important. There are 3 essential elements that determine what will happen on the ground: mandate, personnel and funding, or, in very old terms, politics, blood and treasure. Although in truth the equation is more complex. If a mission's deployed at all, what shape that mission is intended to take and then what shape it actually takes, I think are dependent on 8 key factors. Without a slide, I'm just going to have to ask you to stick with me on these 8. First, the political interests of powerful actors and the political pressures and incentives that are brought to bear outside of UN structures. Second, the mandate provided by the Council. Third, the guidance on peacekeeping more generally provided by the C34, the Special Committee on Peacekeeping Operations, which is part of the GA, and I'll come back to that later. Fourth, the funding provided through the 5th Budgetary and Administrative and Budgetary Committee. Fifth, Member States' willingness to contribute troops, police and assets, and the capabilities of those troops, and their political will to actually be active. Sixth, the permissive or obstructionist behaviour of the host state. Seventh, the mission management and guidance provided by the Secretariat. And 8th, the leadership of individuals on the ground. Our SRSGs are very, very important. Okay, so Australia engages across those 8 aspects to greater and lesser extents. Now, when we're telling ourselves the story, when we're telling the world the story, we do have to be careful. We have to be careful not to be arrogant or disingenuous. We should be honest about our story. So, as we've heard, personnel is where we're most certainly weakest, which is a real shame. I understand the reasons for our deployment configurations. I've rehearsed them. I've defended them. But I don't believe all of them, to be quite frank. But there are practical and political reasons that we need to be aware of if we're going to address it. Because the contrast of what we're willing to deploy into Afghanistan and Iraq compared to UN missions speaks for itself. It says a lot about the value we place on certain bilateral relationships and the value we place on the UN. Contributing troops and police isn't just about saving lives in country X. That's very important. But it's also about our faith and commitment in the UN peacekeeping instrument. But beyond that, it's about the legitimacy and the utility of the UN. It's about us backing the institution as something that matters and something that should remain relevant. So while all of our concerns are valid, we need to put that in context of what the UN means to us. We've heard from a couple of people great ideas about precisely what Australia could do better in terms of personnel contribution, personnel and assets. Couldn't agree more, so I'm not going to go over those again. I might just add that were we to make some of these more niche contributions, a rapid reaction company, an ISR company, we might even be able to convince our Kiwi mates and perhaps our Canadian mates to do something similar and get, a little bit more momentum there. Importantly, it would signal that we back the UN, we really care. And I think responding to something that Penny said today, and also has been picked up by a couple of others, it would raise the profile again of the UN within Australia, within the broader Australian community. When we have a bunch of people who have served, it's on their Facebook feed, their mates see it, it becomes something that is part of Australian culture. So I think that what we need to do is look at precisely why. What are the reasons that we're not, why our contributions aren't different? I was having a good chat with Dan over the break about concerns regarding Medivac, CASEVAC capabilities. It is a true concern, but it's also something we can do stuff about. So let's think creatively. As has been mentioned, our civilian contribution is really problematic. We have no SRSG. And this is also really important for national understanding of what goes on. And just a quick story. I have the fortune of living in Wellington at the moment. And recently David Shearer was appointed as the SRSG in South Sudan. He's a Kiwi. And it was all over the New Zealand media. New Zealanders were proud that their guy was going out there to South Sudan. And he is doing a good job, so rightly so. But the interesting thing is, I remember a couple of days after he was appointed, I was in Bunnings buying paint. And I was chatting with the guy who was helping me work out the right paint. And, got talking about the UN. And he knew about David going out, and because he'd read about it, he had some views on, what he should do out there in South Sudan and what was going on. And that was fantastic. And I fear that if I had a conversation with a guy in Bunnings down the road here, he probably wouldn't know where South Sudan is. So those little things make a big difference. Just galloping through these next things so we can get onto the story. We're well aware of Australia's financial contribution, and as has been pointed out, that's an obligation, not a choice, so we shouldn't pat ourselves on the back too much for that one. Now, on the political front, because that brings us to the story. We do have political influence, substantive political influence within our region, but that's not where most UN peacekeeping takes place. We have shown ourselves an active Security Council member, but that occurs very seldom. But where we can show sustained political and diplomatic engagement on peacekeeping issues is in the General Assembly in the C34, the Special Committee on Peacekeeping Operations. And it's there that much of the Australian story on the protection of civilians takes place. Okay. Very quickly, a little bit of background on the protection of civilians mandate. Different from what we just saw in UNRWA, we're talking about protection of civilians in the peacekeeping context. It wasn't something that was envisaged for early UN missions. They were focused on more passive tasks. And then in the 1960s, we had the UN deployed to the Congo, and it used force to protect civilians, but had no guidance on what it was meant to do, so just made it up as they went along. The period between 1960 and 1999, which saw deployments into internal conflicts, saw a lot more of grappling with this issue. It also saw the major failures of Srebrenica and Rwanda, which caused a retreat from UN peacekeeping, but subsequently caused the UN to reclaim protection and decide this was important. So then in 1999, the UN mission in Sierra Leone was mandated to protect civilians under imminent threat of physical violence, a language formulation that has been used in almost every subsequent peacekeeping mission. However, between 1999 and 2007, these mandates were given almost pro forma, but not much was done about it. I mean, the missions that had POC mandates couldn't really implement them. POC and the Council came to be viewed more as a humanitarian thing, and the Council focused on specific at-risk groups, women and children. Importantly also, the normative discussion moved from the Council to the GA and looking at humanitarian intervention and the responsibility to protect. Then things took a turn in 2007 when things started really going badly in the DRC. And the Council responded to that by bringing it to the centre of the mandate of that mission and UNAMID as well, and the mission of the mandate of the mission in Darfur. So then the UN's two biggest, most complex missions had POC at their centre, but we didn't really know what it meant. So, enter Australia. This is where the Australian story starts. So I started as a policy officer in the defence team at the Australian Mission in March 2007. My very first week on the job was the C-34, which, although it was a baptism of fire, was also a great opportunity to learn very quickly the key issues, policy issues of UN peacekeeping. My boss was a fantastic Australian colonel, Tim Simpkin, who, determined not to waste the 10-minute walk from the Australian Mission to the Secretariat, decided that every day I would be taught about one policy issue or another. And I clearly remember the POC lesson. He'd just got back from a trip to the DRC, and his thoughts were, the protection of civilians, it's not a military term. And yet we've got force commanders and young guys in the field expected to implement this. They don't know what they're meant to do, but they're going to be held to account for it. Things are heating up, they're going to go badly. Watch this, we're going to have to deal with it. So that was my introduction to POC. But the C-34 managed to ignore it, not deal with it, not even try. And we were busy with other things. We were preoccupied with Secretariat reform and sexual exploitation and abuse. Interesting, because 10 years later, those are the same preoccupations right now. At that time, the Capstone Doctrine was being developed, and I was engaging in that process on behalf of Australia. And through that, although POC didn't get much of an airing in that document, through that learnt a lot about POC. So talking to people, ideas bubbling. Victoria Holt, who at the time was working for my current organisation, the Stimson Centre, wrote a fantastic research paper called The Impossible Mandate. It was great. And on the strength of that, she was invited to New York to brief the council in an ARIA formula meeting, which is a more informal meeting. I met her, we went to the pub, had a really good chat about her research. She drew some great diagrams on napkins, and that's where the idea started. Okay, we can actually do something about this. And to my mind, Australia could do something, we're in a position to do something, and therefore we should. So I pitched it to my boss, and he gave me enough rope to hang myself by. So off we went. The first hurdle was getting support within the mission and from Canberra. To be frank, my DFAT colleagues at posts were uninterested. They were unaccustomed to a policy initiative coming from the defence space, and they thought they had it covered with all the Australian work on R2P. The proposal didn't even make it off their desk back to Canberra. So I circumvented them, and I knocked on the door of our ambassador, Robert Hill, another great man who was always keen for an opportunity for Australia to do something good at the UN. We managed to convince him that we were onto something, so he swung his support behind us, and off we went. And with the ambassador behind us, Canberra didn't push back. Next hurdle was the Secretariat. Again, quite conservative, but we wanted to get people on board before we launched out into the GA. The Secretariat didn't want us to touch it. They were worried that if member states got involved, it would be politicised and jeopardised the practical work that was just starting to happen. Fair enough, that often happens, and they're right. But without broader political support and the funding that goes with that, any efforts that they would have been able to achieve would have been minimal. In fact, I remember clearly when I receiving an email from a mate within the Secretariat, within DPKO, saying, "Don't touch it, you're going to kill it." I showed that to my boss, who was then another great Aussie colonel, Rob Manton, who I think took that as a challenge, a personal challenge. And in good military fashion, he made a decision, backed himself, we're taking it to the C-34. So we took it into the C-34. I'm not sure how I'm going for time. Oh, 5 minutes. Oh dear. Okay, I'm going to have to go quick. C-34 was born of the Suez crisis that Jenny was talking about, because the GA said, if we're going to be paying for this, we want some voice. It can't be all in the council. So the C-34 was born. Unfortunately, it has regressed into some very difficult political dynamics, which I've got lots of information here, but I'm not going to go into because I have 5 minutes. Nevertheless, it's not the useful forum that it could be, and the opportunity for the broader membership to really have a voice in shaping how the UN is going to do the maintenance of international peace and security. The Council decides when and where, but surely there's a role for the broader membership to decide how. So in we went with our language. Our mates, Australia and New Zealand, got behind us, as did Costa Rica and a couple of the other Latins, which was great. A lot of people were very wary. It was a controversial issue and, frankly, confusing. And even some like-mindeds were not keen on it. The problem was, firstly, we had to explain. I spent so long explaining to so many different people that POC was actually something different from R2P. And then there were all the issues of, then what is it? Is it a military task using force? Is it humanitarian activity? Is it implementation of IHL obligations? Or is it the way things end up when everything goes well with the mission? So very difficult. We had really tricky negotiations, and into the 11th hour, literally it was midnight, the report was hanging in the balance and the issue was foregone in a grand trade. But we'd got it on the agenda. We'd started the conversation. But after that, we had a big responsibility. We then had to, take it forward. And I'm proud of what Australia did next, because we didn't have a grand political agenda. We just saw that there was a problem and we could help fix it. So how could we do that? And in true Aussie fashion, we decided, okay, well, let's have an honest, frank, robust discussion about it. So what we did is we held one of the key things we did is we held a workshop along with Uruguay, the Uruguayan mission. Now, this is interesting because it's good to have, broader support for an issue, but also we had to, because we didn't have the credibility, not actually having anyone out there in the field protecting civilians. It was very preachy for us to be talking about this. So we needed to hook up with a large troop contributor who really had that credibility. So that goes to my moral to this story, which will be any minute now. Sorry. So we hooked up with Uruguay, and it was a risk for them. It was a controversial issue, and yet some brave and good people took that risk and off we went. It was a great workshop. It was great because we brought a bunch of people together to have a good chat away from the political structures, political pressures, political choreography of what goes on within the UN. We had member states, and from them, military and police advisors, diplomats, political. So we had a good mix. We had think tanks, but most importantly, we had people from the field. We had some very brave and eloquent voices of 3 generals, one of whom we have here today, our very own Patrick Kemet. And it was them, and it was their testimony that actually there was a problem and it needed to be fixed. That's what changed things. So we got this conversation going. It was a success, and importantly, it created a community of people working on this issue, talking about it, which we could then take forward. The following year, the DPKO, the Secretariat, was doing some work on this, which started to come out in that year. The DPKO OCHA study, which Patrick mentioned, the operational concept, that all happened in 2009. And as did the next C34, which finally it was ripe for discussion. So we took it into the C34 again, had some very robust negotiations, but we got language into the report. That matters. Hopefully Lisa will expand on why and how that matters. And it's been in almost every report since. So I left the mission in 2009 and passed on the baton to Lisa and Mike. Mike at the time was with the Australian Civ Mill Centre, who did great things. So Australia, through their various diplomatic and other channels, continued to do incredible things. They did the hard work. And I'll let Lisa speak to that. But it was amazing and just how far we had come in just a couple of years to go from no one understanding what POC meant or what the texture of it was, what it was actually about. Thought hadn't been given to how to resource it. It wasn't in planning documents. Missions didn't have a POC strategy. People thought that the UN wasn't practically able to do POC. That's still a question. But that therefore, politically, we shouldn't go there. That's no longer a question. We're there. In just a few years, everyone was talking about it. It was a hot topic. In fact, it was hard to find a peacekeeping document without the words POC in it. It was accepted that this is going to be a central part of UN peacekeeping, so let's think about how to get it right. And I think that Australian diplomacy played a significant part in that, and I think that the way that we did it was a very Aussie way of doing it. And finally, so I think the moral to this story is that Australia can and does have an impact, but it needs to be progressive, forward-leaning. It needs to be bold. It also needs to have people in the field to have some credibility to those claims. And finally, and this isn't a blatant pitch, it actually makes sense. I've just finished this report on improving UN situational awareness. Now, this is an issue that New Zealand did great work on while they were in the Council, but it needs more champions. And it's something that I would love to see Australia engaging on and leading on. So the point is that there are diplomatic initiatives that can make a difference that Australia can take up, has taken up and has done well on. I'm proud that Australia played the part that we did to help ensure that POC is now at the heart of UN peacekeeping mandates, which certainly it is. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you so much, Heidi, for those fascinating reflections and your story. I mean, you're such a great storyteller that your tale about Australia's diplomatic engagements on this idea, and first your reflections on how ideas are born and spawned and how they travel, their trajectories, and then showing us an example of precisely that. It was absolutely fascinating. And I guess we get to continue the story with Lisa. Lisa Sharland, of course, is the head of international programs at the Australian Strategic Policy Institute at the moment, and she's been engaged on the POC issues and peacekeeping, peace-building strategy as well ever since she was with the Australian mission in New York as a defence policy advisor. So Lisa, over to you.
Thank you very much, Jeremy. And I must say it was great to hear Heidi's. I've heard that story many times, not necessarily from Heidi, but certainly from then Colonel Rob Mountain when I took over the helm when Heidi had left the mission, and heard many reiterations, and I think he might have been a bit more blunt in the assessment of the willingness of some countries to engage on the issue. But certainly it was really great to hear that. And I think one thing I'd like to say at this particular point in time is, given this is a UNAA conference, and I know there are a lot of students in the room and people who are interested in their careers, particularly in looking at the UN, I'd really like to highlight, I think, coming in after Heidi had been serving in that Defence Policy Advisor role, I got on the ground in the first 2 days, and that's completely getting overwhelmed in that New York space and all the different UN entities and what goes on. And I must admit, the steady hand of Heidi, sort of me taking over from her when I was the Defence Policy Advisor and knew very little and certainly did not know what POC meant, was enormous, and that support has been ongoing. And I should also thank in particular Mike Smith, who I worked very closely with when he was at the helm of the Australian Civil Military Centre and coming to New York quite frequently. And I think it just goes to the value of, there are a lot of people here in Canberra and elsewhere, Australians, who are incredibly supportive of one another and the work that they are doing, and I'm very thankful for that. So there's 3 areas I'd like to touch on very briefly today. So firstly, I want to talk a little bit about the importance of diplomatic engagement and consensus when it comes to peacekeeping as part of what often gets called the peacekeeping partnership. Second, I want to pick up a little bit from where Heidi left off. I don't want to leave the story hanging there, and talk a little bit about the progress that was made from 2009 onwards and up until now when it comes to protection of civilians. And finally, I thought I'd take the liberty, since I guess I'm somewhat the last speaker of the day until we have the wrap-up session. I know you're all probably a little bit tired, but want to go in a little bit about how we match policy engagement with Australia's commitments to peacekeeping. That is matching what we say with what we do. So first of all, why is diplomatic engagement and consensus critical? And this will go over a little bit of what people have pointed to today. I only have 2 slides. I don't like using PowerPoint, so it'll be brief. So this is a bit of a map, and this is a lot of the stuff that Heidi was talking a little bit about this. We've heard a number of presentations about it doesn't capture all, I will say. I'm sure I've missed something, but the numerous different entities and bodies that are engaged in peacekeeping in New York, in the field, host governments, troop contributors, and a lot of the nexus for those discussions is certainly taking place in New York to a large extent. So you have the entities that plan peace operations, the UN Secretariat that we have sitting there to the right, which includes the Department of Peacekeeping Operations, which may be changing its name in the near future. We have those authorising the peacekeeping missions, the UN Security Council, which may be guided by Secretariat advice, although not strictly. It may be guided by financing concerns about missions or host government requests. It tends to be strategic in approach, but not always. You've then got forums, and as Heidi was talking about, this sort of body that sits there called the Special Committee on Peacekeeping Operations. And there are often debates about the role that particular body plays, and this plays out in the politics a little bit. Those that serve on the council, the P5, well, why would we bother with a GA body when we can do what we want in the Security Council, basically? But then why that body is important and why getting an issue like protection of civilians into those discussions was essential is it is the body where troop and police contributing countries have a regular voice on what is happening in peacekeeping. And that is why it was so critical that the body take up that discussion and it wasn't just left to the Security Council. You've then got other entities like the Fifth Committee, which talks about budgeting, and sort of the financing and missions, also gets a little bit into policy discussions as well and posts and where they move about. And then in addition to that, and I think this on occasion gets neglected, but of course you've got the host governments. You've also got the troop and police contributors who operationalise the mandate. You have regional organisations. And one, I think, increasing challenge for peacekeeping at the moment is non-state actors and what role they're playing in some of these discussions and how they fit into the context of peacekeeping. So there are several challenges that play out in this context. You have the differences between the UN Security Council and troop and police contributing countries who argue they are not consulted regularly enough. At the same time, the Council will argue, well, you are consulted, but you don't come to the table with any issues that you want to raise with us. You then have the disconnect on occasion between headquarters and the field. And then mandate decisions which may be driven by other concerns in terms of the context that they're taking forward. So into this is only my second slide, and then that's it for the slides. This has been discussed a little bit, but I thought this gives you a bit of a visual representation of the politics of what we've got happening in peacekeeping. We've heard about the divide between those that contribute the financing, which is an obligation, and those that contribute the troops and personnel. So this is a list of the top 12 financial contributors and the top 10 troop and police contributors. You'll see there's only one country at the moment that sits within those two lists. The rest diverge. And this is what has really played out, particularly in the last sort of 5 to 10 years in peacekeeping, and driving a lot of the tensions and political challenges that we've seen between on different issues, whether it's related to the reimbursements that happen to the troops and personnel on the ground, whether it's related to contentious issues around protection of civilians or intelligence or a myriad of other things and capabilities. This is sort of a real challenge, and this is the environment where the discussion on these issues and why diplomatic engagement around these issues and finding consensus is so important. When there are breakdowns in that partnership, it has an impact at headquarters, it has an impact on member state willingness to contribute and engage in peacekeeping, and it has an impact in the field and the people that missions are mandated to protect. Now, I never thought I'd do this at a conference, but I'm actually going to quote Donald Trump for a moment. He said back in December 2016, the United Nations has such great potential. I can't do the voice. The United Nations has such great potential, but right now it is just a club for people to get together, talk and have a good time. I have really good memories from my time working on negotiations in the UN, as I'm sure Heidi does as well and others. But the talking is important in an effort to reach consensus. That's how change starts, and that's often how consensus is reached. And that's why Australia's engagement on protection of civilians has told a really important story, I think. So I'm just going to go back from that. So this brings me to the second part, sort of picking up from some of the points that Heidi was making. Protection of civilians, getting from sort of policy to practice. So I actually wanted to start in, fast forward a little bit to 2011, and there's a reason for that. So the negotiations in the C34 body happen annually. They happen in February, March each year. You basically have a bunch of member states and regional groups who put down all the text that they want in the report, and you think it would be a great way to start. We'll start with a blank sheet and we'll negotiate all that text. No. You start with last year's report, you add all that text in, and then you try to negotiate a coherent document by consensus. And I think the document at last count, I can't even remember, I'm sure it's up to 50 or 60 pages, the report itself. So it's quite complex. By 2011, protection of civilians was a contentious issue still. Language had been included for the first time in the C34 report in 2009 and built on further in 2010. Yet we still hadn't secured reference to the need for guidance. There were also some political challenges at this point, as the Secretariat, as Heidi had referred to, had developed an operational concept. There was a lessons learned framework. What are we learning from the field? And they'd also gone through a process of developing a framework on mission-specific strategies. This built on some of that conceptual work. And it was a document that was intended to guide missions in the field about how do you develop a comprehensive approach across all parts of the mission to protection of civilians. And I'll just read you out a quote from that document at the time, because this goes to the point I'm making. The concept also recognises that the protection of civilians is primarily the responsibility of the host government, and that the mission is deployed to assist and build the capacity of the government to fulfil its responsibility. However, in cases where the government is unwilling or unable to fulfil its responsibility, Security Council mandates give missions the authority to act independently to protect civilians. Bearing in mind that missions operate within the principles of peacekeeping and in accordance with the mandate, missions are authorised to use force against any party, including elements of government forces, where such elements are themselves engaged in physical violence against civilians. Now, for anyone who was aware of the debate around responsibility to protect and how that differed from protection of civilians, in that you needed the consent of the host government, you can see how this had the potential to cause debate. I'll use a lighter term, debate on the issue in the C34 context when we wanted to get this framework recognised. Australia, along with Canada, New Zealand, the European Union and others, were trying to acknowledge the framework. At the same time, though, there were wider political developments that were taking place. And those of you who recall, we're talking about March 2011. And I'm not sure if anyone can recall what was happening in March 2011, but the Security Council authorised the intervention into Libya to protect the civilian population. So here you started to have, and I remember distinctly sitting at the negotiating table in the room. It was the last week, it was the evening, you know it's going to go on forever. Everybody's gone down to the vending machines and it's going to be a really late night in the UN building. And I remember a colleague at the time coming to me and saying, the UN Security Council's just authorised this mission. This is going to have an impact on negotiations that we're having in the room right now. Sure enough, it was a topic of discussion. And it was a topic of discussion when you had further action taking place in Cote d'Ivoire that was quite robust in the peacekeeping mission context a couple of months later. It was also contentious because our negotiations at this point, the partnership was beginning to fray a little bit, and negotiations did not finish on time and kept going on for a couple of months throughout the year. And that pattern continued for a few years. But all of this is to say, I think that initiatives, the Australia-Uruguay initiative that had been underway and in fact has continued to this point, there have now been 9 Australia-Uruguay workshops that have taken place since that very first idea that came about in 2009. And it's been seen as an important initiative, and it goes back to, I think, the discussions happening between headquarters in New York and the field, and making sure people are aware of what's actually going on the ground and the realities of what's taking place. It's also about diplomats engaging in discussions about these concepts and why they're important and where the differences lie. So there are 3 things I wanted to highlight about Australia's engagement on protection of civilians. Firstly, primarily, a lot of this has been through the C34 defined consensus. While there might be debates about the relevance of the body that have happened at times, for most countries, as I indicated, this is where they get to have a robust debate about what's happening with peacekeeping policy. The second area where Australia has been quite engaged has been support to training, development of guidance and resources on protection of civilians. This has included financing extra budgetary activities, and I must note, in addition to the assessed budget, which Australia is required to pay, a lot of initiatives get taken forward in the UN through extra budgetary funding, which is essential. And this has been important around an issue such as protection of civilians, particularly when it comes to training activities. But there are 2 particular aspects I'd like to highlight. One was the work, and this happened when Mike was head of the Australian Civil Military Centre, with the African Union to develop guidelines on protection of civilians. And that was seen as a really critical and important step and initiative that Australia was engaged in. I think there is a lot of scope to pick up on that, and it hasn't really moved forward in terms of Australian engagement at this point in time. And the second one was the development of a documentary on protection of civilians. And I was really heartened when I was on a military and police advisors field trip in Goma in DRC, and I saw a screenshot of the documentary cover come up when they were doing a presentation of protection of civilians. And I think it's a reminder of the reach and the importance of these initiatives and engagement. And the third point that Australia was engaged in, I think, was through the Australia-Uruguay Workshop Series and ensuring that there was a comprehensive discussion and debate taking place on these issues outside of formal UN bodies. That initiative, as it has moved forward, has engaged a range of stakeholders, think tanks as well, IPI, Stimson and ASPI at this point in time as well, and has really, I think, provided a landscape or a discussion platform for issues around protection of civilians. Because as we've heard from Patrick and others today, there's still a long way to go to make sure that what's happening about discussions in New York is actually translating to reality on the ground. In fact, in November 2016, each of these workshops is focused on a different issue, and last year it was focused on the issue of accountability, drawing on the findings that had come out of the independent investigation that Patrick headed up into Juba and the violence that took place in July. So that was a focus of the discussion. I think it was really important, and it provided member states with an opportunity to engage with issues in a forum that was quite substantive. And to summarise that point, I want to refer to some remarks that were made by Vice Minister Cancela, who was the former ambassador from Uruguay who was engaged in the workshops, at the UN Security Council debate on protection of civilians in armed conflict in January 2016, when they were president in the council. And I quote, "It is important to recognise the achievements we have obtained in recent years. No one is questioning whether the protection of civilians should be a component of peacekeeping operations. What is basically at issue here is how. Uruguay, aware that peacekeeping is a multidimensional activity involving many stakeholders, has made its modest contribution for several years in order to achieve the broadest possible consensus on the issue, because, as we have always said, in order for protection to be effective, every link in the chain must be strong. In particular, we are proud of the work our Blue Helmets are doing in the field and of the frank, open and constructive debate that, together with Australia, we have promoted since 2009 to the present." And I think it was really important there to see that a partner that had been brought on diplomatically and engaged with by Australia was recognising in the Council how important that partnership had also been to them as well, and the work that had gone forward. So over the last decade, we've moved from whether POC is part of peacekeeping to how we do it. We've seen the development of policy on protection of civilians, guidance for military and police components, and high-level political commitments through the Kigali Principles, which Australia eventually signed on to after a little bit of time. Yet I think the most transformative aspect, as we've heard from speakers such as Patrick this morning, is political will. It's often noted that there has been significant normative progress on POC in recent years, whereas there's still a need for significant progress on the ground. That requires committed, prepared and equipped countries to engage in peacekeeping. There were high expectations following the drawdown in Afghanistan that there would be a peace dividend in 2014. That hasn't resulted. Although we have seen European countries re-engage in peacekeeping more substantively in recent years. There have also been concerted efforts to generate commitments. And the high-level summit that will be taking place in Vancouver will follow on from London last year, the Obama summit in 2015, and the one headed up by then Vice President Biden in 2014. So there is engagement at the political level, but it's still yet a discussion of how that's translating at the ground. Australia has been engaged, but I would argue not substantively in some of these discussions. There is no bold thinking taking place in government about whether Australia could be doing more to contribute to peacekeeping. Rather, the approach, and I realise this is somewhat controversial, but I guess I'm the last speaker, so I will make the point. The approach is generally about what is the minimum Australia can do so we don't appear to be ignoring our international commitments. That speaks volumes about the state of Australia's current UN peacekeeping commitments. And that is not to detract from, I think, the work that has happened and the importance of diplomatic engagement, but I think that disconnect creates some problems. And this brings me to the third aspect of my presentation. I'm going to go through this very quickly, noting the time. So how can Australia build on its history of diplomatic engagement to ensure that Australia remains committed and engaged in UN peacekeeping? How do we match what we say with what we do? And there are three things that I generally highlight to people, particularly here in Canberra when I'm talking about peacekeeping. It's the policy engagement, training and capacity building, and deployments. There's those three aspects to our engagement. And you need all three, I think, for Australia to be committed to UN peacekeeping. We've been really strong on the policy engagement. On the training and capacity building, it's a strength, but I think that's being challenged by the level of our deployments in the field and the experience that we have there. I will note briefly, I don't want to overlook the fact that when I'm talking about policy and diplomatic engagement, I think it's worthwhile highlighting Australia's engagement on the Security Council, because I think that was important in terms of our engagement on peacekeeping issues, given its role in that area. And I think it raised the bar in terms of the level of understanding of some of the complexities of what was happening in the field, with diplomats incredibly engaged in those discussions and championing resolutions around issues such as policing and small arms and light weapons. If I was to make one recommendation when it comes to policy and diplomatic engagement, it would be that further consideration is given as to how Australia can contribute intellectually or to the ideas debate around peacekeeping. It shouldn't just be about what's in it for Australia or what lessons we can share from our region, but what future do we want for UN peacekeeping and what should that look like? And I would put to you that that's probably an area where the UNAA could be engaging in that discussion. On the second point of training and capacity building, Australia has been quite engaged. We heard the Foreign Minister talking about the work we're doing with Vietnam. But I think the risk here is that given the number of deployments that we have in particular at the moment and the low levels, is that in terms of credibility compared to other contributors in the region, it will continue to be challenging for Australia to go out there and conduct training, recognising that there are other countries in the region who actually have more experience and more diverse experience in participating in peacekeeping missions. And that's something that Australia is going to have to continue to consider in terms of supporting training and capacity building. And that is not to detract from the excellent work that we have being undertaken by the ADF and the AFP by any means. There are some incredibly dedicated individuals who are undertaking that work, but I think this is a long-term challenge that is going to need to be considered. I think in areas such as women, peace and security and protection of civilians, there's real opportunities there. And the fact that Australia does indeed have a military gender advisor deployed to UNMISS, I think speaks volumes of the support to those particular issues and engagement on some of the issues related to women, peace and security. And this brings me to the final point before I wrap up, on deployments, personnel and capabilities. Why is there a gap between Australia's statements in support of peacekeeping and how Australia is willing to engage? Take the example of policing, and a few of you would know I'd pointed this out earlier this week in a piece. We had reference throughout this conference to the good work that has been done through our UN Security Council term, for instance, in the first resolution on policing. Yet with the drawdown in Cyprus, for the first time in over 50 years, Australia has no police peacekeepers deployed to UN missions. So we are doing great work, as we heard from Commander Cates about the work in the Pacific and the engagement on training, but we actually don't have any police deployed to a UN mission on the ground. That's a challenge. I think another major impediment, of course, is our strategy in terms of engaging with peacekeeping right now, is that most of the missions are taking place in Africa. And the approach in terms of Australia's engagement with Africa, I think, makes that challenging because we don't have a comprehensive approach. It would be a much easier discussion if there were a mission that was happening in the Asia Pacific right now, because I think it's much easier to make that case. So it makes it much more difficult to make the case as to why we should engage in UN peacekeeping when it's much further away. And I think that requires concerted engagement about, our support for the rules-based global order and what that means practically. As I noted earlier in the piece I wrote this week, there are only 3 G20 countries that currently deploy fewer UN peacekeepers in Australia: Mexico, Japan and Saudi Arabia, which doesn't deploy any. Australia's ability to influence, understand and retain institutional knowledge about UN peacekeeping is diminishing. It creates challenges in securing leadership posts, and it to some extent diminishes the credibility that Australia has in some of these discussions that are taking place. There are opportunities, absolutely. The cooperation that the ADF had with Japan and South Sudan, I think, was a fantastic model. There are opportunities in terms of our burgeoning security relationships with European partners, including France. And I think it provides a fantastic platform for practical engagement with regional contributors, because there are a number of Asia-Pacific countries engaged in missions where we have interests, such as South Sudan right now, where we could be cooperating. There will be a summit in Vancouver in November. I'm hopeful that we might have some commitments there, but I'm also quite measured in my expectations. So in conclusion, diplomatic engagement is essential, but Australia can't keep resting on that to highlight the value that we attach to UN peacekeeping. We need to be matching that engagement with practical commitments on the ground if we're to contribute substantively to UN peacekeeping and its success in the future. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Lisa, for finishing the portrait in terms of that story of Australia's diplomatic engagement with POC, and then also for your concrete recommendations, which are, so there is a recurring refrain in terms of some definite things that the Australian government could do to improve or to sustain its commitment to peacekeeping, UN peacekeeping. So I might invite all the speakers to come up to the stage. I think we've got about 10 minutes, 15 minutes of Q&A. So, yeah, of course. So, is it on? So the floor is open. I think given that it's just 15 minutes that we have, we'll take questions in clusters. So feel free to raise your hand. And please, if you could remind us who you are, that would be terrific.
Alex Jones from DFAT. I just wondered if either of you ladies know how David Shearer came to be the SRSG for South Sudan, because often it's tied to a significant troop contribution and New Zealand provides even less than us. So I just wondered what credibility it had in pushing for that position, and I do think it's a legitimate point to make that that is a value add that Australia could be doing. We've had a police commissioner in Liberia who did an excellent job, and previous force commanders in historical missions. So I think that's a good role for us to play, but I wonder what support Australia really needs to provide to those individuals who are qualified to actually get them into those positions.
Thanks, Alex. We'll sort of hold that question. Are there any other questions at this point? I see Patricia Garcia down here, and then another question over here. We'll take those three.
Thank you. Great. Just like to ask you if you could please follow up on the story of the POC protocol. I was involved in the working group with the AU, NGO, and Australian Government, the Civil Military Centre, Mike Smith in 2010 for the discussion of the POC protocol with the AU. And just wanted to know what has happened with the status of that protocol and where it's gone in terms of acceptance of that POC protocol for other troop contributing countries and police contributing countries, as far as a POC protocol to be able to be taken for the other countries.
Great, thank you, Patricia. And just down here.
Thank you. So my name's Angela Baker. I'm from the World Peace Flame Foundation. My question's for you, Brian. Fantastic to hear about the student-led leadership in the schools. I'm just wondering, in the curriculum or within that realm, is there opportunity and already in place or in the future for empowerment programs for those kids that help them not directly to deal with trauma, but perhaps just through the programs, through their learning, that they can move on out of that generational cycle of challenges that they're facing?
Okay, great, thank you. So the first one, why do the Kiwis get SRSG and we're still, waiting? We're the eternal bridesmaid.
Because David Shearer is very good.
It's true.
Right, so I've given away enough secrets today. I'm not gonna tell you the backstory of how David Shearer got the job, but it's true. He is very good, and he had a very distinguished UN career working in a bunch of different organisations, mainly on the humanitarian side. So in that sense, SRSGs, as you know, they're not political appointments. It's not something that you can, it's a recruited post, so you have to have merit, but it definitely helps to have the support of your government behind you. And certainly when I was at the mission, I didn't see Australia do that. For elected positions, certainly, onto the Human Rights Council, I think the International Seabed Authority, certainly, but not into these leadership positions. And we have fantastic Aussies who have done great things. We need to be bringing them to New York and showing them off, holding, function so that they have this profile, and we need to be knocking on the right doors and saying, hey, this guy would be, or girl, would be super great. And SRSG posts don't tend to be attached to large troop contributions. That's the case for Force Commander posts, but not SRSG posts. I mean, if you look at them, a lot of them haven't. And I wonder if I could share the microphone with Ian Martin on this quickly, if that's all right. Thank you.
Yeah, I would like to say something about this. I don't think the New Zealand government played a very significant role in the choice of David Shearer to go to South Sudan. And on the one hand, I would be delighted to see an Australian SRSG, and I can think of Australians who I'd be delighted to see as SRSGs. But I really would warn against the view that member state pressure is the way that senior appointments should come about. It's the biggest problem in the quality of UN performance in the field. I could name 3 SRSGs who have been disastrous SRSGs, each of whom was chosen as a result of strong pressure from their governments over better qualified candidates put forward in the recruitment process. And Patrick could tell you exactly the same about force commanders. So what you need to be arguing for is meritocratic, genuinely meritocratic recruitment processes for senior posts in the field. And yes, then make sure that Australia makes visible the candidates who it has who qualify on those grounds. But please don't join the biggest problem in the quality of UN appointments, which is inappropriate pressure from member states.
Thank you, Ian. So the POC protocol, Lisa.
Thanks, Patricia. Very good question. I must admit my knowledge of exactly how that is being implemented at the moment is a little bit diminished. I think one of the things I would point out in particular is the work that happened. So as a regional body, and I mean you were very heavily involved when this was happening both here in Australia and in Addis, it was a regional representation, I think, of trying at a time when the UN was looking at how to develop policy and practical guidance around protection of civilians. You know, the African Union seized upon that and the opportunity to develop its own guidelines. And that was recognised by the UN and by the Secretary-General as a really important initiative. And I think there's a lot of overlaps with, obviously the UN I think has careered ahead in terms of the guidance it's been developing, but I wouldn't be able to give you the specifics in terms of answering exactly where that's up to right now, so apologies for that.
And Brian, the question from Angela.
Yeah, thank you. Could I just make a quick comment on David Shearer? I've worked with David Shearer. He was working in OCHA in Palestine, and I really think it's a great choice. His reputation, his credibility, his experience is well known, and I do believe, as Ian said, he's been selected on merit. But I would say, Ian, as well, that we still have got a long way to go in regard to political interference in regard to senior appointments in the Secretary. I've been involved with the SG's office in different capacities over a number of years. And, you know, I won't go into detail, but the influence that's come from different member states, and depending who was Secretary General, was more influential than others. It's quite sad to see. So I endorse completely what you're saying, and I like to see the Secretariat move, you know, further in that direction. On the question, thank you very much for the question. The short answer is yes. The protection program, the framework we have, is very much around education, around the curriculum development to ensure that, you know, students do, if you like, learn not just the issues around, you know, reading and writing, but also around life skills, and also, you know, trying to, if you like, cope with the devastation which they, you know, inherit and which they experience. And we have, you know, social workers. We have a range of programs which are called life skill programs. And I'm actually quite impressed, as I said, with students, because I do really believe that the future of some of the challenges we experience day to day are through the students. And you can see it every day in terms of their behavioural changes, how they go home and try to encourage their parents in different practices and traits and things like this. So I think that's the future. The entry points are through the students, and that's why we spend a terrific lot of time in looking at the quality of teachers we engage. We do have some bad eggs, and that goes in any employment situation. But generally, it's a positive one. Thank you.
Thank you, Brian. So we have about 5 minutes left, so I'd encourage perhaps one last round of questions. Yes, there's Up in the middle, up the back there. Thanks, Lockie.
Yeah, I was just wondering for the UNRWA programme whether there are any sort of collaborative arrangements in place with Australia's humanitarian refugee intake, and also whether any of the problems that your clients experience are, for refugees who do migrate out of that region, whether any of those problems are reproduced, for example, in Australia. I know that a lot of the issues over there are linked to religious conflict and extremism, and whether any of that can be exported if they are repatriated, for example, in Australia, and how it can be dealt with based on your experience.
Okay, thank you. Any other questions at this point?
Hello, I'm Tamer Morris. I'm a student from the University of Sydney. Just a question regarding protection of civilians. Protection of civilians has been constantly morphing, and we saw in 2013 with the Force Intervention Brigade in DRC. Do you think that the UN is going to morph it again? Do you see any kind of new kind of movement with protection of civilians, and is the UN going to try kind of a different structure?
Great, thank you. And who wants to be the person to ask the very last question of the conference? There we go, Peter.
Peter Thompson, I'm with Amnesty International, but question in my personal capacity. I think the next great opportunity is actually involvement with the UN is with us, the likelihood that we'll be on the UN Human Rights Council. And getting familiar with the international system and linking in with that. I mean, I think it's great for DFAT and the officers involved, and the same way being on the Security Council was fabulous in terms of the learning experience for the department and people working in the field. So, but I think it's important to be engaged, but I think overarching that is just I think it was alluded to in the presentation, so a lack of enthusiasm, a lack of vision about the role the UN plays for Australia, and the need to rekindle some enthusiasm.
Is that can I take that as a comment, or do you want a response on that?
A response would be nice.
Yeah, okay, great. So the three final questions. I guess, Brian, that first question is most relevant to you.
Yeah, sure. Thank you. Well, I'd like to start by paying recognition, acknowledgement and tribute to Australia. Australia is one of only 9 countries that provide what's called multi-year funding to UNRWA. And that's very important for us because we have guaranteed funding and also a cash flow. So we suffer from cash flow as well as funding. So Australia does contribute in a number of ways, both in terms of financial, to our program budget and also to our non-program budget. We have an emergency appeal in Syria and one in Gaza. And that's extremely well, funded through the Australian government. So for our DFAT colleagues, I'd just like to put on record, and maybe it could result in, extra money coming through. No, I don't expect that. Look, the other thing is, in terms of NGOs, look, we actually do benefit from a number of initiatives from NGOs in Australia. We just had Save the Children come to a number of our host countries to talk about water management. We have Red R just setting up a regional office in Amman, and they'll be delivering capacity building initiatives, and a range of other things that are taking place in terms of cooperation with both private sector, with NGOs, and with obviously the government sector, and also obviously multi-faceted functions, and World Bank, etc. Multinational. So look, the thing is, there's a number of things happening there. Look, there's not a lot in regard to the refugee side because there are obviously a lot of policies in place which, provide some limitations on what's possible. We tend to try to learn from best practices. So therefore we bring in Australians, and we're lucky to have at the moment, international complement, not just me, but there's about 15% of international staff are from Australia. and that's increased since I've been there, but that's probably just by chance. Some are saying because you're the Director of Human Resources, maybe it has had an impact. I'd not like to think so, Ian, because I haven't had an undue influence. So look, the short is that we haven't done a lot on the refugees side. Look, the other quick comment I'd make is the fact that, you know, we have got a very small mission, UN mission, UNSCO, situated in Palestine, in Jerusalem. But it's not, you know, like a peacekeeping mission as such. We have got a DSRSG situated there and an SRSG, but it doesn't have the same sort of, you know, there's no peacekeeping mission. It's like a more political mission. And so I'd like to see, Tim, that we did have a mission come, you know, a peacekeeping mission, because maybe that might have a big impact in terms of getting the, you know, the different, you know, factions brought together. Just put that on record. Thank you.
Okay, question on POC morphing. It's interesting. I mean, so often a lot of the policy and politics tends to follow what's happening on the ground. That's where a lot of stuff is driven from, a lot of these evolutions. And we've seen that, right? Recently, we've seen the POC sites in South Sudan that was spoken about yesterday. And that's a real morphing in POC. I mean, the fact that POC would be provided through essentially static forceful protection is, you know, wasn't part of kind of certainly the doctrine or what we were thinking of, but that's happened because of what's on the ground. So oftentimes that's where it's driven from. I think Lisa mentioned the intelligence work that's happening, peacekeeping intelligence at the moment within DPKO. That may have some impact on, well, being very hopeful, more proactive POC perhaps. So yeah, it continues to evolve, continues to morph. I'm not sure which way it's going to go next, but yeah, watch this space. I'm not sure I completely quite got the question on rekindling enthusiasm, but I'm just going to take it as how do we do it? How do we rekindle enthusiasm in the UN? I reckon the best way would be a really awesome movie about fantastic UN stuff that reaches the broad public, and they get interested in, oh my gosh, this UN is actually kind of cool. It's doing great stuff. Maybe even a book that's based on. Anyway, that's what I think would rekindle enthusiasm. Handing over to Lisa.
I don't think I can follow the movie aspect. So briefly, I guess I'll go from that point. Thanks, Peter. I guess on a more dull sort of public servant approach, I mean, certainly in terms of engaging on the foreign policy white paper and hoping there's a more consistent, I think, approach to our UN engagement. I think that's going to be really important going forward, that we don't just react when we have a campaign that's underway, that there is, and that's not to say, and I will say for anybody who's been engaged in DFAT or working in New York, there is consistent engagement. That's not a criticism that we aren't consistently engaging, but this is about, I think, having a more strategic look ahead 5 to 10 years from now in terms of the issues that we want to be looking at and prioritising instead of perhaps reacting a little bit. And on the question that Tamer raised about protection of civilians, I'd just make 2 brief points. And I think Heidi's already alluded to this a little bit. I think the issue of consent and what we've seen playing out in South Sudan and the differences of opinion within the Security Councils, particularly when it comes to deployment of the Regional Protection Force, for instance, highlights that I think that is a potential area that will remain under ongoing discussion. And then finally, I think looking in the context of Mali and the challenges of operating in an environment where there's you're operating effectively alongside a mission that's carrying out a counter-terrorism mandate, what does that actually mean for the protection of civilians, I think is something that's going to continue to need to be looked at.
Terrific. Well, please join me in thanking the panel for a terrific last session, which was both deep and broad. Thank you all so much. And I understand that we might have a video that, at the very end, we'll have a video which seeks to increase your enthusiasm. So, thank you all.
Okay, we're almost there. I'm looking forward to bed tonight, I have to tell you. And so we want to get straight into this last session, and if you had asked me at the start, would there be this many people here at this time on a Saturday, I would have said no. So that's a tribute to our speakers and our chair, our panel chairs. So wonderful. Okay, this is how this session will go. Firstly, I'm going to ask for your quick comments, and they will be recorded, on the questions that were posed to you earlier. Here they are. You don't have to provide anything. You can email us those or tell us even verbally whenever you like, but we want to capture your immediate thoughts if you have them. Then I'm going to make some observations to wrap it up. Then, probably the most important thing, we're going to ask our volunteers to come up on the stage so that we can thank them all. And then, as we're about to depart, the video wrap is going to be played for those who want to see it. Now, I also am aware that some people have to leave to catch flights and other things. So if you have to go, you have to go, and that's fully understood and fully appreciated. So for those who do have to go, thank you very much for attending this conference, but I will give thanks in a moment. Okay, first question. The first question: what should Australia do to enhance peace and security through the UN? Does anybody want to say anything? They've got a burning issue that they think they want to say. Please.
Yeah, so now I believe Amanda Cates has left, so this is partly in my personal capacity. What should Australia do to enhance peace and security? And just touching on from the 2 points just made about deployments, one thing is with AFP, when they deploy on a UN police mission, it's ODA, the funding for it, and I believe the OSCD's widened the definition. So I think even now some military deployments can actually count as ODA. I'd probably need a DFAT or Formose person to help me, but there's a cap on ODA that John Langmore mentioned, the percentage or whatever. So therefore, as a hypothetical, if you were to try and send 100 people, 100 police or military that met the definition of ODA offshore at $50 million, that contributes to that ODA cap. So that's $50 million technically you can't spend somewhere else. So that ODA, the fact it's ODA and the ODA cap in government policy could be seen as a bit of a negative or a deterrent in some of the ability for Australia to enhance peace and security.
Okay, sorry, and could you just say your name so that we can record
Apologies, Warwick Fry, AFP.
Thanks, Warwick. Okay, good point, and I think we need to capture that. Any others on that first question that people want to say? Okay, up the back, please.
Yeah, I'd like to just answer. Australia should be enhancing the peace and security. There's 2 reasons. If we are only interested in the regional area of where the country Australia is, then we also be interested in joining those forces of our neighbour countries, so then that we learn via training, and by the work of these people, we can learn it when the time comes, and Australia can apply it more effectively. Yeah.
Thank you, and your name?
I'm Peter Tang Ha from the Vietnamese community, and UNAA.
Thank you, Peter. Any other points? Please. We'll give you a mic, John. John Hegarty. Yep.
Yes, John Hegarty. Well, is that working?
It's working. Yep.
Obviously, we're all realising peacekeeping much more important than the use of force. It was wonderful news that this world-famous institution is going to have a major development in 2 years. Brenda Nelson announced it, emphasising the peacekeeping role. I hope that perhaps the name of the Australian War Memorial could very obviously include that, like Australian War Memorial toward peace. Change the name.
Okay, thank you. Danelle? Danelle Davis?
Danelle Davis, UNAA, Queensland. Make these roles for peace and security attractive to civilian women, so we can look at careers for young women in these areas.
Okay, good point. Any others? Otherwise we'll go... Oh, sorry. Dr. Zenny Edwards.
Zenny Edwards from the UNAA Peace Program. I would just like to reiterate what Penny Wemsley said. Australia should regard the UN as a consistent, constant factor in peace and security and not treat it like an a la carte menu and use it when it needs support. So I think that consistent and constant support and endorsement of UN is what Australia needs to do. Thank you.
Okay. Right. Oh, we're starting to heat up now. Yeah. Okay.
No, I
Got
just
to
want
keep an eye on the clock too. Sorry.
make one remark because I'm Norwegian, so I feel I can say it. I'm an Australian permanent resident. I'm working for the UN abroad, UNHCR, UNICEF, UNESCO. I just want to say that looking at Australians abroad, I would like to see more diversity. Not just white Australians, but also Australians coming from a diverse group. You have a lot of women, a lot of Australian women, and I'm working with a lot of great Australian women, but not a diverse group. Thank you.
Thank you. And since we're a great multicultural country, that should be easy. Any others? Otherwise, we'll go on to Patricia. Mike, Patricia.
Just like to put the question on the area of focus on conflict prevention. How could we strengthen the number of deploying mediation experts, specialists in the area of mediation, to strengthen the area of conflict prevention in peacekeeping? And the second one is with protection of civilians, the nature of also including, because of the extreme violent humanitarianism sort of landscape we're working in, also humanitarian workers themselves are included in the need because they are also targets and needing to include protection of civilians, including actually humanitarian workers as well, as part of that group of civilians.
Okay, great. Up the back up here. I won't have any time for any observations at all.
Colonel Ian Cumming. One of the things that I see missing within Commonwealth government departments within Australia is an acknowledgement of one of the really significant things that UN has done most recently, which is the Sustainable Development Goals. We don't use them. As guides, we've got a set of Commonwealth procurement rules, and the Commonwealth government spends billions of dollars, and there are small lines in there about sustainability and ethical behaviour, but there's no longer guidance about how to do that. And I think UNAA could actually take a leadership role in going to Commonwealth government departments and say, let's use these as your guidance to how you purchase your billions of dollars.
Okay, thanks Ian, and we'll include that comment for both of the questions then. Okay. Yes, good enough.
Nando, UNAA ACT. I think Australia should reaffirm its commitments to peacekeeping, but not just only peacekeeping, but overseas diplomacy and multilateral aid as well. Because I say this because Australia has world-class capabilities in terms of, as evidence with the ADF and AFP's abilities. So I believe that puts us at a good position to utilise our position as a middle power in the Asia Pacific as well.
Okay, thank you very much. Oh, we're getting hot now.
Hello, you got it?
Barb?
Yeah, hi, it's Kevin Chang again.
Sorry.
A couple of...
Yeah, sorry, Kevin, I was looking behind you, but that's all right. You go first and then Barbara.
Sorry,
yeah.
I had the mic.
Yeah, sorry.
Yeah, sorry.
I saw Barbara's hand.
Hijacked it, yeah.
Yeah.
Two concrete things relating to our Human Rights Council upcoming, not just candidature, but membership. One thing is to make sure that we really support the UN system in putting human rights up front to implement that policy, especially in countries where there's no peace operation. We have countries in our region, such as Sri Lanka and Myanmar right now, where the UN's development and humanitarian efforts are not putting human rights at the forefront of our delivery, and that's a regional concern for Australia as well. And secondly, is just to also support the human rights due diligence policy for peace operations, and that is of course related directly to our support, especially right now. We expanding our defence attaché and also some of our other capacity support to non-traditional allies to make sure that we support the implementation of that.
Okay. And we'll make this the last one on this question, otherwise we're going to run terribly over time. We'll probably have the evicted.
This is really brief. Barbara O'Dwyer from WILP. Australia should sign the nuclear ban treaty.
Okay. Okay. I'm sure Ramesh Thakur would be so delighted to hear you say that. We did write a piece on that, by the way, UNAA. Okay, question two. If there's anybody else who has anything on that first question, please email or speak to us afterwards. Question two, anything specific that people want to get off their chest?
Okay, James Cox from Pacifica. The UNAA needs to build the belief and understanding amongst the public and decision makers that peace and security is achievable. And we have named this and committed to it in the Sustainable Development Goals. Mm-hmm. We have increasing amounts of data that are available for us to be able to track progress.
Okay.
From there, we say that the UN is the instrument for this to be realised, and that Australian support for that work and involvement in it is in our interests.
Okay, great. Thanks, James. All right. One here.
Alex Jones from DFAT. One thing I would like the UNAA to do is to work in partnership with Lowy on including more questions in its annual survey about Australian perceptions about the UN and also about peacekeeping and how much Australians think we should spend on it and how many troops they think we should send, because that sends a powerful message to our ministers.
Yeah, great initiative. Yeah, thanks, Alex.
Angela Baker from the World Peace Foundation. I don't think Heidi's idea of a movie is actually all that bad, to be honest, and I was having a similar thought when you were up there on stage sharing the stories. I also think the clips that you've been showing between the sessions are really powerful, and I set as my alarm pretty well every morning Beyonce's song I Was Here, which was part of a big UN presentation.
Yeah.
Perhaps in cinemas, perhaps, some sort of media program that highlights the UN's activities out there to really inspire people.
Great idea, and you'll help us find a donor to fund that. Yes, we've got that down. You've committed to find a donor for us. Right up the very back,
Paul Maliate from UNAA New South Wales. This is my second national conference, and I think both times I've come away thinking, given the calibre of the speakers and the content, that we should have 3 times this number of people in the room. I don't have the answer as to whether it's about marketing or it's pricing or venue, but I think that's something we could sort of strive for.
Okay, good point. And right in front of you, while that microphone's in that part of the world.
Hi, I'm Peter Tangha from the Vietnamese community, as well as UNA member from New South Wales. I never heard of UNAA before 2 months ago. So my only answer to this is that UNAA Australia should have increased their promotions in terms of raising awareness of what UN is doing. We can listen to it on TV, but then that is so far away in terms of peace and security within Australia, in terms of gaining membership as well as gaining the audience, like Paul was saying, that we need to engage more with the community. We heard more about Amnesty International, we heard more about Human Rights Watch, but we're UNAA conference and the work is sort of never been
That'd be a
heard
great thing for the Vietnamese community to help us fundraise for. Thank you. A great suggestion. Who's next? Zeni?
Seeing the Peace Program. Zeni Edwards from the Peace Program, UNAA. This is why we have the UNAA Peace Program. We promote peace, but a positive way of promoting peace rather than there's enough talk about war and violence and all of that. There's so many aspects of peace, and we do that through the SDGs. It is a difficult job, but we are getting there. Small steps is what we do. My last comment is this conference has had some valuable insights. We really need to let everybody else know what would come up with this. We need a communique to send to the government, to everybody who matters, to send to the UN, to let them know what we think and what we want to achieve, and we need now to walk the walk and rather than just keep talking about it. Thank you.
Yep, very good.
Yeah, I'm Adam Knight. I think as well, maybe a lot of the Hollywood celebrities promote the UN through goodwill ambassadorships, but I'm not sure how many Australian celebrities do that. Maybe some of the Australian celebrities or sports stars, particularly maybe from multicultural backgrounds or Indigenous backgrounds, could get involved in the UNAA and promoting the UNAA.
And there certainly were some Australians on the SDG video that we showed. Yes? Right here?
Hi, Chloe Marrick. I'm a student from ANU, and from a youth perspective, I've found that UN Youth really engages well within the school communities, but I think that there's definitely a missing chunk right in the middle when we're at kind of the best of our abilities to engage with time that we have while we're at university, and when that's not being utilised by anyone, because a lot of the UN youth stuff is focusing on mock UN things and kind of getting people excited about the UN, but not actually engaging as once we've got the skills that we can offer and the time that we can offer when we're not working.
Great. I'd love to have a UNAA chapter in every university in Australia. That's how Eleanor Roosevelt built it. Patricia, up the back there.
Thanks, Mark. I think that UNAA should continue on the modernisation and professionalisation that we've been moving along in, particularly in the last year. I think enormous steps have been taken. I think also that all the divisions working together as what they are now, and the national programs, I think is really a way to go. And I feel if we continue with that, and with more utilisation, probably where we're getting there is of technology, social media, which is not as expensive as going out into the streets. But I think being a unified group, working together, and if we continue that, I think that we will continue on a successful path where we're going.
Okay, thank you. I'll take one more if there is one. Is there anyone who hasn't spoken yet who wants to? There's one down here. Is there any other one? Okay, you're here. Oh, sorry, there.
Okay, thank you. I would suggest something that I think may not be very practical, but perhaps UNA can be courageous and explore the possibilities. And that is a number of sort of training opportunities. You know, we have lots and lots of people with lots of experience, and we have lots of young people who are just waiting to finish their masters and do 1 or 2 years with NGOs or even working with other government departments and want to go and serve in this field. And POC, I mean, already, I did IMTC sort of training with being in the field, 2 days training. But 2 days is not even enough to cover all the manuals under POC training. And so if UNA can sort of consider some of those trainings for young people, but also people who are pretty much in the process of retiring from DFAT and Defence and AFP and other sort of government departments who are thinking of going into this space. Yeah.
Okay, well, you will be pleased to hear that the board is already focusing on the feasibility of trying to establish a training program. So, but there's a lot of work to do for that. If there are any other points that anybody wants to make, or if you go home tonight and you can't sleep and you need to get to us, just email your submissions to admin@unaa.org.au, okay? admin@unaa.org.au. Now, how are we going for time, Matthew? Yeah, but what time are we supposed to finish? Now, that time. Okay, I had some observations which would probably take about 10 minutes or so, but I don't want to inflict that on you. Do you want to hear them, or shall we go straight into... Yes. We want to hear them. Okay, all right. Well, I'm going to do just 3 things. Firstly, I'm going to thank people. Secondly, I'm going to give you my observations. And thirdly, I'm going to tell you where UNAA is going, so as quick as I can. Firstly, I learned a long time ago, if you want a good conference, you've got to have great speakers and you've got to have great chairs. And I just don't think we could have had better speakers or better chairs on this. And I just want to thank all our speakers and chairs for just doing an outstanding job. I also want to acknowledge and thank our sponsors, because without our sponsors we wouldn't be here. We don't have the money in the till without them, and so they really coughed up and I'm pleased to say covered our costs. And of course I'll thank our UNAA team right at the end. Okay, so this has been a very, very rich conference, and thank you for your input just at the end. I'll give you a few observations and thoughts. I know you'd love me to get up here and magically conclude this, but it's been so extensive and so rich, I've been trying to get my own thoughts in order. So let me talk just firstly about the session's day 1 on honouring our military, police and civilian peacekeepers. These are the 5 points I got out. You will have others. They're not exclusive. Firstly, what came out to me was the critical role of the UN in maintaining the rules-based international order. And if we let that slip in any way, then our national security will be imperilled, as well as global security. The second point is that Australia has contributed and made a real difference to UN peace operations and across the whole gambit. And we should all be very proud of that. And we should try and build on that. But we have made some fantastic contributions of which, you know, many countries can't say they've done that. And that we should build on our successes going forward, and we should recognise it. The third one is that what came out of that first day session as well was that Australia could do more than we are currently doing. That we currently have an ad hoc approach, and often we're too influenced in our approach to the UN by what the US wants us to do. And that's a danger, I think. The fourth point is that the Australian Peacekeeping Memorial now provides us with a fantastic focal point. When I say us, I mean Australians, all Australians, with a fantastic focal point. So thanks again, Tim, to you and your team for that 12-year, work that you did to make this come to a reality. And we need to think of ways in which we can use that as a focal point to take things forward. And similarly, my last point on this was that I was so encouraged from what Dr. Brendan Nelson said about where the Australian War Memorial is going. And I think that provides a fantastic opportunity for peace operations to remain in the consciousness of all Australians. Turning to today, strengthening Australia's support to UN peace operations. The first thing that jumped out to me was that the peace and security agenda reforms that are happening really need to be supported actively by Australia. We've been talking about UN reform for a long time, and often in government I hear they need to reform. Well, it's on the table and we have to get behind it. And if we're going to get behind it, we've got to have credible policies to back that up. And that requires a bit of work. And one of the first things we should be doing as a nation, in my view, is linking, and it was already commented before, but we should be linking this peace and security agenda to the SDGs, and particularly SDG 16 and SDG 17. And that, I think, would give us a really good way to go forward. All right, the next point is on observations were about conflict prevention and peace building, which was one sort of area we looked at, and peace operations generally on the other. And there were cross-cutting issues across both of those two areas. The first thing that came out to me was it doesn't matter what you're doing in peace operations or peace building or anything, it's a political endeavour. And unless you have that political focus, you won't really achieve anything. And so we've got to put a lot of front-end focus on what is the political agenda that we're trying to achieve and how can we contribute to it. I think that Marty Natalagawa's trust deficit issue really struck home to me. There is a trust deficit. And associated with that, I think there's a diplomatic deficit. And I think we heard from Penny Wensley that there's definitely a diplomatic deficit in Australia at the moment. And we need to try and encourage an improvement in that area. There's also, right across the Australian population, a knowledge deficit of what the UN is and what it's doing. And we have to do much more work in that area. And when you look at those three deficit areas, you'd have to say that from an Australian perspective, that really then starts to question our credibility as a nation and as a member state of the United Nations. So we need to work on all those deficit areas. We definitely need clearer government policies and budgets in relation to the whole issue of peace operations. And we heard about the policing's not doing it because it's in the ODA budget or this or that. This seems really ridiculous to me. We're either doing it or we're not doing it, and we budget it, and we have to do it. So we've got to align policies and budgets, and then there's a whole range of niche areas that were identified, which are so cost effective. They cost peanuts to do. Protection of civilians, women, peace and security, gender-based violence, security sector reform, mediation and conflict resolution. There's just a few of them. Human rights. There's just a few of them. They're niche areas where they all impact on peace operations and cost peanuts, honestly, and very cost effective. Now, just let me tell you about a little cost effective thing that we did when I was in the Civil Military Centre, and it was mentioned before, and I won't tell you the whole story about it, but we needed votes for the Security Council. And one of the problems was we didn't have a big footprint in Africa. So how were we going to get all those votes? Well, one of the ways we did it was to work with the African Union to get them to develop guidance on protection of civilians. Why was this also important? It was important because in the United Nations, the non-aligned countries in particular wouldn't sign up to this protection of civilians. But if we got the African Union to sign on to it, the resistance in the UN would evaporate because the African Union is a big body and we're in most of the peace missions. So I dropped into Addis Ababa, spoke to the African Union. They said, we don't want another talk fest on POC. And I said, no, I thought we could come up with guidelines of how the African Union will do it. And they said, fantastic. Have you got those? And I said, no. I said, well, how are we going to do it? And I said, well, I don't know. Why don't we get some of your guys, bring them to Australia, lock you up until you come up with the guidelines and we'll work with you. And he said, that sounds like a good idea. The POC guidelines for the African Union were done by a small group of Australians and Africans in a motel in Queanbeyan. At the end of that conference, everybody in that room, it went for 3 or 4 days, it was hard work, everybody was validating the draft guidelines. Would they go with them? Only Egypt was valiantly trying to say, we don't want them in the finish. And we also had a fantastic chair, the ex-president of Mozambique, Salim, who basically told Egypt in the finish, shut up. And everybody at the end got up one after the other and said, great, great, great. And then the UN in New York said, great, great, great. And then the guidelines came to fruition. A handful of people in the Australian Civil Military Centre, and one of them's up here, Peter, take a bow, and a small group of Africans from the African Union brought that to fruition. Peanuts it cost. What a great influence we had. Hey?
How many votes did you get?
Oh, I don't know. I never mentioned that. But we got enough votes to get security on the Security Council, didn't we? Okay. Now, so there's a lot of areas there. Training and doctrine has been mentioned, and we need to do more on training and doctrine, and including in POC. We haven't really converted properly POC guidelines into doctrine for the AFP and the ADF. There are some documents around. They're not what I'd call doctrine. And we could take the leading role in that and be the first country to really develop it, and then do what Patrick's talking about, make sure that it's put into training courses for all the troop and police contributing countries. Again, easy for us to do. Regional coalitions and regional conflicts. Okay, I thought that was another big point that came out of peace operations. We need to be working more regionally, and Australia can do a lot in that. We were able to put Interfet together when there was no standing coalition, and we put it together, 23 countries. So we've got the ability to do it, but we're not trying very hard. Yes, the POTC, Peace Operations Training Centre, does some really valuable stuff, but again, it's a microcosm of what we really could be doing. And when everybody talks about UN operations, they say, it's over there in Africa. Well, let me tell you, let me remind you, as I try and remind people in government all the time, there's 3 in our region where Australia's national security was done under the UN flag, and we couldn't have done it without the UN. And they're all very different. The first one was a little thing called the Korean War. The next one was the Cambodian elections. And the third one was East Timor. We couldn't have done it without the UN, and it was in our vital interests in all of those 3 occasions. That's pretty Asia-Pacific to me, and there's a whole raft of other issues bubbling on now where I think the UN is likely to have to get involved. I'm sure if something happens in Bougainville that it won't be just Australia and a little group of countries like last time. I think it would have to be UN. That's just my personal view. I really liked Lisa's, I like Lisa anyway, but I really liked when she summed it up for me in terms of linkage of policy, training and capability and capacity building and deployments. If you don't have those 3 going together, your credibility in peace operations won't count for much. And leadership positions. We really need to get more leadership positions, and you're not going to get leadership positions unless you're contributing. So, and our knowledge of what's happening in peace operations will quickly evaporate unless we having people on the ground. And I think Dan Bennett pointed that out very clearly yesterday. Okay. The final point I want to make on this issue is really around... it's just going back one. In 1993, the ADF put out a defence policy on ADF contributions to peacekeeping. And I read that document again the other day, and it was brilliant. But it's not being enforced now, and I don't believe there's any substitute for that document that's replaced it. I just don't think there is a policy. But that particular document said ADF contributions to the UN should be done on a case-by-case basis, and I think that's absolutely right. But that we should have a floor commitment to which the UN will know that they can rely on us. And that figure was 200. Right now in the UN, we've got about 30 odd, because when they quoted the figure of 57, that included the people in the MFO, which is not under Blue Beret. So, okay, so I just thought the document's been done. We need to try and get that back on the agenda. Okay, the hardest issue, in my view, about strengthening Australia's support to UN peace operations is cultural change. How do we change the culture in the government that sees UN peace operations as almost an afterthought or something to do when they feel like doing it? It's going to be hard yards to do that. And particularly if you're not putting people into the field, then you won't develop that expertise that you really need to take it forward. So cultural change is critical, and linked to that, and we need leadership on this. And a number of speakers emphasised the importance of leadership. We need ministers to come out and say they want this. We need the Gareth Evans type people who believe in this passionately, and they're the only ones that will force government departments to change, I can tell you, because secretaries and CDFs and police commissioners take their lead from what they believe the priorities of the government are at the time. So we really need to work on that leadership issue. And finally, on the cultural change, and it's been mentioned here already, we need greater national awareness about the UN and what it's doing and what we should, and we need to promote that. Now that's a big job for UNAA. We can't do it alone, but we have to do it better. Okay, so what does UNAA now do next as a result of this conference? What are the outcomes from this very rich conference, I think? Well, first of all, we have to promulgate the proceedings of the conference and not only of the conference, but also of the Academic Network Roundtable the other day on SDG 16, which was very, very fruitful, and the forthcoming Status of Women Network Roundtable, which will take place on Monday under Sheila Bayard. And Jeremy did a great job on the SDG 16 one, and I'm sure Sheila will as well on Monday. And we need to, in relation to getting these messages out, we need to have some immediate things that we do, and then we need longer term things that come out. Certainly we need to promulgate them, all the papers that we can get from the speakers as soon as possible, and then we need to look to developing it into something more. We need to see what we get out of today and discuss with Wafuna about how that can get into better training and education. We need to, I think, what it's convinced me of is that when we see these fantastic people come and speak, we probably need an ongoing speaker series. And we've got wonderful Australians who are coming through all the time, but we're not capturing them at the moment. I saw when Ian Martin did his conversation with Jeremy the other night at ANU, it was a full house. And we could do a lot more of that, I think. We might even be able to charge people money. I'm proud to announce that there is, in relation to peace operations, the International Forum for the Challenges of Peace Operations. It's been going for 20 years. It's the premier international organisation that looks at peace operations and has a great influence on peace operations. And Australia has been invited to Australia is a member, and it's the Australian Civil Military Centre from the government side, but there is no civil society member, and the UNAA has been invited to join that, and if we can afford it, we will do it. So we'll be in the mix. And finally, UNAA, all around this topic, from what's happened so far over the last 2 days, is SDG 17, we have to partner with as many people as we possibly can, because UNAA can't do it all. And you saw Steve Kallela here today, and he and I are already talking about strengthening that partnership, and there's many other organisations which we need to strengthen with, including ASPI and Lowy. That's a good one. Okay, so that's from me. So I think, Matthew, we can now invite our volunteers to come forward. Yes. Can we have all the United Nations Association of Australia volunteers? Hey?
Just the conference volunteers or all volunteers?
No, or the ones who put the conference together. Yeah, the people who've helped with put this event together. Yeah, please. As most people probably know, UNAA is a volunteer organisation. We do have a couple of paid staff, but not many of them. And that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to get money so we can have more professional staff in. But even if we had another 10 professional staff, we could not do it without volunteers. And when you have volunteers, you also have to have a volunteer head. I think that's the most difficult job in the world, to have a volunteer head, because they can always tell you to shove off if they want to. But honestly, without this team here, it would have been totally impossible to put this together. And I think everybody would say that it's been a very smooth conference, apart from the coffee that wasn't there this morning, which was not our fault, by the way. And so I would just like, firstly, everybody to thank all of our volunteers. Amazing job. But there has to be a leader, and that is Jenna Allen. Please, Jenna, come out here. This wonderful woman might have a strange accent, but she has done an amazing job. And at any time of the night or day, she's just responded and pulled this together. And Jenna, because we don't have any money in UNAA, I gave you your gift last night, your real gift last night, which was the special audience with the Governor-General and Lady Cosgrove. But we do have something very small to give you.
Thank you so much.
And is there anything that you would like to say? Please.
Yeah, sure. I won't take long, swear. But I just want to say, I only have a couple weeks left in Australia. It has become a home for me, and I could not think of a better way to finish my time here. The speakers have been amazing, the chairs have been amazing, everyone who's attended has been amazing, and it's just been an amazing capstone experience to my time in Australia. And so thank you all for putting up with me in the position. Thanks. Thank you, Mike. Thank you.
Thank you. Jenna does have an Australian boyfriend, so I had a quiet word with him. Yes, okay, so hopefully we'll see you back, Jenna, very soon. Okay, so I wish everybody safe travels, particularly those going long distances. Patrick, I know you're staying till Monday night, and we will have dinner tomorrow night too. And thank everybody for attending, and I think we're going to show the wrap. What a good way to finish the scene. Thank you very much.